Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Quentin Grafton. He's a professor and laureate fellow, chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in Water Economics and Transbody Water Governance. He has a degree in BA of Economics from Massey and MSc from Iowa State University and a PhD from UBC. He's currently addressing us from Australia, and he has been working all around the world on various aspects, and in particular interested in water and the issues of water and climate change. So over to you, Quentin.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I had a share screen up. So is this the...
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so it's someone else's share screen, I think, isn't it?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, can you see it? Can you see my screen?
No.
Okay, how about that? You see the full screen now? Thanks so much, Art. Thank you, everybody, and my sincere apologies for my mistakes and why we're delayed today on the 6th of December. I'm going to talk about too much, too little, and too dirty water. It's a term that's getting a lot of traction in the last 2 to 3 years. It comes out of a number of sources, including the UN and the World Bank, and I also myself, who's been using it. It's a useful way of beginning what's happening in terms of the world, in terms of the world of the water crisis. Too much, obviously, is the issue around flooding and sea level rise. The too little is around droughts, if you want, hydrological droughts. And the too dirty, I suppose, is fairly obvious. It's about pollution, but it's also about lack of clean drinking water or safe water. It's also about the sanitation. So it combines the entirety, in some sense, about what is happening in the world water crisis and focuses on the consequences. So what I tend to do, and I'm going to go through quickly, I appreciate the time is very limited given I've started, or I made you start so late, is to give a brief review of what this crisis is. And there's multiple ways of describing it. There's no one way of describing it. I have a particular way. Others would have a different way. Then I'll go through some of the issues around water limits and climate change. You're obviously very familiar with climate change. And I was very interested in what Paul was talking to us about just a few minutes ago. The guess who of water. Of course, when we talk about a water crisis, at least in an anthropocentric term, we have to ask for who, for whom. Where is this crisis? What is it, and for whom? And this is the guess who of water. It will come as no surprise. The guess who, of course, people would think of the global south or low-income countries. But the guess who, of course, also includes marginalized and vulnerable communities in countries such as Canada. I'm doing work in Ontario, and I'm working in Australia in the context of Indigenous communities, remote communities primarily, but not exclusively. And we see a whole series of challenges around them in terms of their safe drinking water. Then we'll go to connections. In some sense, the most globally alarming pieces of work here around connecting the water to the food, to human security, and then some particular views on water futures, issues around resilience and how to think about that. Clearly, this is about responding to what I would call a predicament, an emergency, a crisis, however term we want to use, and how we can best do that, and what are the means to do that, given the many challenges that we face in all sorts of spaces, climate change, biodiversity, for example, and of course, in the space here, the water space. Too much, too little, and too dirty. So what I will do here is to give you this is a diagram that tries to put together some global statistics. It's not all bad, and there's some interesting pieces of information that come out of this, which I think gives some indication of our ability globally and some places to adapt. So adaptation is, in my view, the name of the game. Adaptation to too much, too little, and I believe, can respond in effectively to too dirty as well. So if you see the too much, this is the flooding events on a global scale. And as we go out from 1991 to 2001, that's one decade there in the inner circle. And we go to another circle, 2001 to 2011, 2011 to 2021. And then you've got this last bit here, 2021, 2022, the last piece of data. So if you see in the terms of the flooding events, there's no systematic trend there. I'm not saying there's any, on a decadal level, although that in itself is interesting, and we can talk about how that data's how it's defined. But what is interesting is the losses, in terms of the number of people affected by the flooding events, and it has declined and substantially declined. And so there's really only one explanation, as far as I can tell, and there's certainly sorted by other evidence, is that we are responding much better to flooding events, at least at in relation to big storm events. Why am I saying this? Well, certain countries like Bangladesh are actually responding more effectively in terms of the number of people that are displaced from flooding events. So that's an adaptation story. You can see it here, not as effectively in the context of the dollars and cents in terms of the in real terms, in terms of the flooding. And then you see a different story. There doesn't seem to be the ability to respond in the context of droughts, hydrological droughts. You see a number story here, but you also see the dollars and cents story. So droughts are actually in a number of ways, which is maybe surprising to you and to many people, as droughts seem to have a bigger impact over a longer period of time. They certainly tend to be longer duration events. And they certainly, we're not being able to respond to droughts in the way that, or adapt to droughts in the way we've, at least in some places, adapted to flooding events. The too dirty story is actually a good news story. The trend is definitely getting better. There are far fewer people who are suffering from a lack of safe water and sanitation. It's, depending how we define it, it's about 60% of the world do actually have safe water and sanitation. But nevertheless, there's a lot of people who don't. So it's about 3 billion people or so do not have water that's been properly monitored. So not all of them will have unsafe water, but a good proportion of them do. So it's 2 to 3 billion. That's a lot of people. And that seems to have leveled out in the last few years. So a good news story, half glass, half full here in terms of too dirty. Not such a good story in droughts. We aren't really managing that well. And some places in the world, we seem to be managing droughts better than we were in the past. So that is a good news story, I suppose, to some extent. You can see the trends here in terms of water access average. That's safe water in the blue, and you have the brown or the orange in the context of sanitation. So things are getting better, but you can also see there's a leveling out. And that leveling out is really where we're heading in terms of sustainable development goals, and particularly SDG 6, which will, it's this clean water and sanitation for all. We clearly are not going to achieve, we're not even going to become close to achieving that by 2030. It's not even close to it. So we've got a lot more to do. And the approaches that are on the table are really sort of doubling down on the past approaches. And that, what I mean by that is it's perception is that it's a filling the gap, that we need more grey infrastructure, hard infrastructure. And of course we do, but the filling the gaps framing is really about getting finance, public-private partnerships, blended finance, mixed finance is how they term it, and then focusing primarily on cities. And I have to say that that's not going to work in the context of the bigger world water crisis. It may help and will help in wash water and sanitation and hygiene in big cities and towns, but it's not going to deal with the fundamental issues around the world water crisis. So it is going to be a failure. It won't achieve what it needs to achieve. And so we can step out of the anthropocentric perspective about humans and the economic impacts and start to look at some of the biophysical measures. And there is a disturbing set of trends, and you can see this over the last 2 decades. And you can see it's no coincidence to the climate scientists who are your part of your group. You know, these are the mid-latitudes as a function of the Hadley cells, but you know, in terms of what happens in our worst climate. But you can see there is a drying trend in the semi-arid arid locations, not exclusively so, but you can see it in Western United States. You see it in MENA, Middle East and North Africa, North India, North China. And there are places that actually have a lot of precipitation that are drying as well. Over here, yes, parts of Brazil, this area is a dry area, but typically there's a drying trend in those drying areas, in those semi-arid areas and arid areas, but not exclusively so. And then this is a sort of a more precise way of looking at it, because you actually doing measurements of both of lake water storage. So these are natural lakes and reservoirs. So you can measure them pretty effectively, pretty well. And you can see these distant colors indicate, the red indicates the declines, and the blues and the greens indicate increases. And you can see that you know, in the equatorial regions, we're tending to get increases, but you get some particular declines in these sort of mid-latitude areas. And then this, I'll go on because we're running out of time. And let's go to the, well, you already know this. So I won't spend any time on that, just the fact, the anomaly for 2023, and it looks likely that 2024 will be hotter than 2023, whilst 2023 will be the hottest ever. So yeah, clearly accelerated warming is taking place. That has a whole series of implications in the water world beyond or be obvious in terms of temperatures. And you can see it again on the land average, the ocean average, whole series of implications. And of course, the standard measurements are typically by the combination of land and ocean. Ocean temperatures are going up rapidly. You don't see it as well here, but it is going up rapidly. So, you know, if we take take land temperatures, it's around 2 degrees already. Just to be clear about that. And of course, pretty much everybody lives on land. So it's actually perhaps a little worse than people would imagine if you take the land temperatures. This here is particularly useful because it does have salience for the world water crisis. Not in the same space, but it does have salience. You would have presumably have seen this. It came out just in the last couple of weeks, just in time for COP. And it's really looking at carbon emissions from a per capita or a consumption basis. So normally where we measure carbon, it's a production supply basis. That's how it is measured. But what they've done here is they've taken the what people are consuming and at what levels are they consuming in different countries and different different income groups. And so you can see here basically what they're saying, which won't come as a surprise, but the carbon footprint of higher income people, which includes a good number of Canadians. You may not think you're high income, but relative to the world you are, as I am, it's incredibly more. So it's 10% of the world's population are responsible for approximately 2/3 of the carbon footprint through their consumption. This is obviously the very wealthy. I'm not saying you in this group, the top 0.1%. But it just sees the dramatic difference. So this is a bad news story in terms of who's responsible. Of course, the people getting affected the most typically are not the highest income. They have all sorts of ways to avoid the challenges associated with that, not least air conditioning and moving. But nevertheless, the good news, I always try to look on the good news in the sense that the good news story is that if we were to do an adjustment around the behavior of a relatively small number of the proportion of the world population, we could get a lot of bang for our buck. So this is just seeing the the sort of differences that we have. So in other words, a whole series of actions, let's say in the space of just air travel, for example, an absolute quota in terms of carbon footprint around there could make a big difference. It wouldn't make a big change in the world and how it lived and how most of us live, but it would certainly make a difference over time. Okay, so everyone talks about climate change as we should. It clearly is an emergency, but it's worth highlighting that even if we fix the climate change problem, which sadly we're not going to, we need to be very much in the adaptation moment right now, given what is happening and accelerated warming. The point about it here is to simply say that these problems in the world water have existed for decades. Yes, they are magnified by climate change, but they existed before and they'll continue to exist until we respond effectively in the water space. So water insecurity is now, this is going back to the 2000s. This is a measure of the last up to 2010 in terms of groundwater. Groundwater abstractions are unsustainable in key parts of the world. I'll get to this a little later. Where the groundwater abstractions are unsustainable really, really does matter. So if it's up in Siberia, which provides virtually none of the world's food, it's less of a problem, at least in that space, than if it's in northern India or northern China or the United States. So if you take the world's largest food exporting countries and you start to have unsustainable groundwater extractions, which is what we do have, then it becomes a problem for everybody because there's a lot of people, who consume imported food, particularly in Europe and Africa and parts of Asia. Flooding, we've always had flooding. I pointed out that we can adapt and have adapted to flooding. I'm not trying to trivialize this issue. I'm just simply saying that there are ways that we can respond. This is not something that we just have to hold our hands up and say we can't do anything. We can and must respond to flooding in terms of moving people, human settlers. There's a whole series of actions that are needed. Droughts are much more difficult to respond to, particularly in the food and on water space. Growing crops do need water, either through rainwater and or through irrigation, and certainly in the semi-arid locations, which are here, you can see them right here. Very high levels of surface water extractions. You need to have irrigation for a good number of the crops that we consume. So how do we do that in a sustainable way, and especially in droughts, becomes very, very problematic. There's no easy solution in the drought space because of its connection to food in particular. Well, we've been unsustainable in water use for decades. That's not a climate change story. It's just a human action story. And of course, with climate change, sea level rise is new, as is the frequency and intensity of flooding events and also droughts. But all of those existed before this accelerated warming that's taking place. And of course, glacial melt will increase the amount of stream flows in particular locations, particularly in the third pole here in the Himalayas, but ultimately will mean much less stream flow down in those very large river systems that come out of the Himalayas. So to put it in perspective, here's the if you want to call it the hydrological cycle on land. It doesn't include the world's oceans here. So if you're looking at the cubic kilometers a year, this is the amount of precipitation that we're getting is 120,000 or so. And a lot of that gets directed to natural vegetation. And of course, it gets transpired and goes back. That's the hydrological cycle. Okay, so what's worth looking at here is what we would call the blue water rather than green water. So green water is the water that's moisture in the soil through precipitation primarily. Blue water is the water in streams, rivers, aquifers, natural storages. And so it's much less of it in terms of accessible runoff. When I say accessible runoff, there's a lot of runoff in the Amazon River, of course, ultimately, and the Congo Basin, and ultimately the Congo River. It doesn't, it serves a very important ecological purpose, but it's not used. It's not accessible for humans in all sorts of ways. So we talk about accessible as in we can, use that water. There's a lot of water in the poles, but it's a frozen form. It's in the cryosphere. It's not available. It's not accessible. So the actual water that's accessible is much, much, much less than precipitation, and we're actually doing a pretty good job. I mean that in being ironic, a good job of using a lot of that blue water. And if you look at these numbers here, in 1950, the start of the Anthropocene, as some people use that year, we weren't exceeding our blue water limit. By this year, we were in excess of. It's a big range, but perhaps up to 400 plus cubic kilometers a year, and that's determined by unsustainable levels of groundwater extraction as well as minimum flows within rivers and streams. So it's big and it's getting bigger, and that has all sorts of implications, which I'll come to in a few minutes, in relation to the nexus, the food, energy, water, environment nexus. So here's just some of the consequences I've highlighted in the previous figures that I showed it to you, the big circle. These are some numbers behind it. We can move on. We started late due to my errors. So let's go to the guess who. And I think it's really important because when we respond, when we adapt to climate change, when we respond, we have to ask to to what and for whom and the hows. Those sorts of questions are really important, and often they're not asked the way they need to be asked. So as we saw in the carbon footprint, there is a water footprint, so to speak. As we increase, though, there's not a clear relationship. There's all sorts of relationships here in terms of average rainfall and the country, but nevertheless, there's some sort of relationship between high levels of per capita income and high levels of water withdrawal. And certainly when it comes to food consumption, high levels of certain types of foods, you'd see this more accentuated than just simply, these are just simply withdrawals in individual countries. You'd see it more on a consumption basis, that you choose the analysis I showed you for carbon. And you can see it from a justice perspective in earth pressures. Obviously, we're screwing up big time when it comes to climate change. You can see that. There is also the implication in this figure that we're screwing up big time, well, not as big, but in terms of water. What this diagram is trying to show is that if we were to increase the levels of water withdrawals in those countries that have low incomes, and communities that don't have access to safe water, so it's a quality issue as well, not just a volume issue. That would impose further pressures on the world water crisis, if you will. That's not to say not to do it. It's just to say that there has to be a reallocation of water, both across time and space, if we are to respond to the world water crisis. And that's certainly true if we're thinking about where most of the water gets withdrawn and what it's used for. So it's about 70% of the world's water that's withdrawn, that's extracted, blue water that is used for irrigation. And the water that's consumed, transpired, evapotranspiration, is about 85% is associated with irrigation, 85%, and possibly even more if we put in livestock. So it's a very high proportion. So the agricultural dimension of world water withdrawals is absolutely front and center to this. Humans who we need water for drinking, etc. It's a very tiny fraction of the world water withdrawals, and of course that goes back into the system fairly quickly. The water is less clean. And so if we take a justice dimension and go beyond simply looking at figures of numbers of people, and I would argue, and others have argued before me, that we need to have a sort of a trifecta of perspective. We need to intergenerational, the rich, the poor, the wealthy, less well off, which is that notion here of justice, but it's got to be intergenerational. Certainly as we withdraw down aquifers in key parts of the world, that has very much implications for future generations and food production and all sorts of implications there. And then to species, we tend to only think about ourselves as a species. There's been a huge extermination associated with the riparian environment. Wetlands still are declining in area and also in quality in general. Not universally around the world, but that's the global trend, for example. And then so there's a whole series of things that if we think a justice angle around it, we need to think about, how do we engage with communities? What sort of frames do we use to understand the problem? Because water is, yes, it's a global, and I'll go to the global again shortly, but it's also very much a local issue. So you have to engage at a local level to be able to get the outcomes that we seek. And that's about, distributive and restorative justice, which I'm happy to talk to for this time at the end. And so if you take a justice angle, I think this is not just for water. I think you can apply it to social justice, and I think you can apply it to climate justice. And I think this is the angle that we need to have if we're going to have a new framing and a new way of dealing with the world's crisis, including the world water crisis. We have to say, the decision making, who gets heard, because a lot of people aren't getting heard, as we know, despite them being 70, 100,000 people in the UAE right now in COP28. There's a fairness and quality, what gets shared. Well, we know that the consumption of carbon is grossly unequal. It's also true for water. The what gets shared, the understanding. Typically, there's an engineering perspective, or even a sort of a neo-rationalist economic perspective here about what knowledge gets valued. There's a lot of knowledge that is important for managing landscapes, riverscapes, waterscapes. That is typically ignored. Indigenous knowledge, for example, and there's a reconciliation. So for example, in Australia, about 40% of the land area is in some form of native title, 40%, 40. But in terms of the water, it's 0.2%, so it's much less than 1%. So we have to have a reconciliation of who's getting what and how's that happening. That really is a justice story, and it's a new framing. I would say a different framing to the standard approach of we got to fill the gap and get a bunch of finance and a bunch of concrete. As much as there is infrastructure gaps, this is much more than that. So I'm going to close by quickly talking through some of the issues which may be familiar to some of you, if not all of you. But it's really important to highlight this because when I talk to people, they get, okay, water crisis, droughts, floods, and then possibly also the issue around implications of food, but they don't see the connection in the global context. So it's worth going through that. So this is just what's called the nexus. It's just simply the coming together, the connection of the food, the energy, and the water. At 85% of the world water consumption for blue water is for food. So, if we're going to deal with the world water crisis, we have to connect water to food and vice versa. Food connects, of course, to water in terms of reduced water quality, etc. And energy is extremely important in the food, fertilizers in particular, but goes well beyond that. And of course, you've got the ecosystems here. Getting degraded. Riparian environments have been massively degraded over the decades, and it's still happening. Which is a function of water withdrawals and how we're treating the water. So that's the brief rundown of it. This gives you some sense of the perturbations that are happening in the global food system. So we have the big world food crisis here in the 1973, 74, high real prices of food. And everyone thought the problem was solved. We're going to keep on getting more and more food per capita, which is in fact what did happen over those decades. And then something happened in 2008. Something was obviously the global financial crisis, but also very high increases in oil prices. And then we see it again, and most recently attributable to Ukraine. It's actually not just the Ukraine. It's not just a Ukrainian conflict with the Russian invasion. There's other issues. So this is we're connecting the in some cases a drought issue here, supply issues, but also primarily supply issues from the energy. So energy prices do affect food prices in a very big way. And you can see those big increases have a big impact on the poor. who much of their budget is spent on food, and therefore they're pushed into hunger or into less secure situations. I won't go through this. I haven't got time since we started late, but this gives you some of the connectivity between what happened in 2008, declining stocks and export restrictions. But the big, I worked in the space, had some papers on this. It really was oil prices. And you can see similar sort of thing, energy prices here, but you also have some other supply restrictions taking place, particularly in wheat from Ukraine and Russia. But there are other issues going on. So the point about it is the system is connected, and the water's connected to food, and the food's connected to the world, and that's connected to energy. And so when this system starts to perturb itself in a number of ways, which has already happened in 21, 22, 2007, 2008, those perturbations I'm projecting will get worse and increasing frequency. That is going to have a big impact on a whole bunch of different people, and you'll see the impact now. I'll just go straight to it. So this is work in progress. It's under review at the moment, but what it's looking at in a particular RCP, representative concentration pathway, that's 8.5. Some people think that's an extreme one. I suspect it isn't, but we can do it with 6.5, 4.5, or whatever you want, the RCPs. But this is looking at what the implications are in terms of reductions in calories in the year 2050. So compared to our baseline, which is 2020. Now this is really, not every country is the same here. So I just want to highlight that. A country like China, obviously, is not the same, or India, both of them together is even more important, are not the same as a country like New Zealand, for example, where I grew up. So, we've got 1.5 billion people in India, 1.4 billion or so in China. So, we've got a good chunk of the world's population. Both India and China are food exporters, okay? There's a series of perturbations that have already begun in India in terms of its ability to food export, but this has implications for countries that are importers of food. Now, the impact here is universal. It's negative and bad, but it's particularly bad in some places. It's bad in the United States, okay? That's bad in Canada. But these are world-leading food producing places. So where it happens here is really important, and their implications in Western Europe. So this is about the food supply, but of course it's not just the supply for those countries. So you see here, Australia, food supply to, percentage is a decrease, but Australia, just like in Canada, we're a net food exporter. So we produce enough food. Obviously, we do import food for about 60 million people, and the population in Australia is just over 26 million. So it looks like it's a bad story for Australia relative to some other places, but just have a look at this. No, it's not such a bad story for Australia because we're a net food exporter. So we export less food when we have higher temperatures and water stress, which is what these models do in the 8.5. And the biggest losers, and this is worth highlighting, the biggest losers are those large food importing places, which includes many countries in Africa. And those reductions well, anyway, it's the proportion of the population that are in food insecure it goes up dramatically. And it's very high. In some cases, it's over 50% of the population. So it's a very bad news story for food importing countries. That would apply also to Europe as well. But the question is who gets the food? And the food will go to those countries. Singapore, for example, is a big food importer for, as a proportion of, it doesn't produce pretty much any food. But the high income countries will be able to get that food, whatever's available from those food countries that are exporting. India's also got a problem for itself. Exporter won't be an exporter for much longer, and the world's largest country by population. So a series of, I think, very bad outcomes coming our way, which we will need to adapt to. We're all going to have to respond to that, including, greater food production in Africa. Otherwise, there's going to be, very, very serious outcomes. So, I mean, I'm just putting up here the nexus risks to highlight the water, food, energy, and environment risks, how you respond to both hazard, vulnerabilities, exposures, and then finally, just to quickly walk through those questions which I started out with. Those are key questions in an adaptation space when we're trying to support resilient systems to be resilient to these shocks that are coming and probably will increase frequency and intensity. The of what, the to what, the for whom, and through what. So it's got to be where we focus. And in the water space, it's going to have to be we'll have to think globally in terms of the connections of food and water, but we have to do it on a local level because obviously groundwater extraction is very much a localized phenomenal, regional phenomenon. It's not a global phenomenon in that sense. So we have to work that how we manage that, and then we'll be different in India than in Australia or Canada. And then no need to tell us to Club of Rome, but we were clearly on the pathway we're clearly on right at the moment is very much a business as usual pathway, and it's going to lead to a disaster just in the food water space, and that I highlighted in the modeling that we've done at 8.5. So we've got to move ourselves, deal with the issues around corruption, accountability, lack of accountability, who gets listened to, all of that decision making, to decentralize it. I think, at least in the water space, transition and ultimately to transformations. But that is the only way to go here. We're still in this business as usual, and much of the proposals and solutions offered at this point in time are really very much business as usual. We're not in this transition, at least in many places in the world. So it's a big challenge, and we have to be part of the solution, I think, in terms of what we do and how we act. So I'll close at that point and stop sharing, shall I? Or?
Okay, yeah, no, thank you. I'm going to be the host for the Q&A session.
Shall I stop sharing or just keep it up? Or
No,
I think stop sharing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Last minute acceptance of being the host for the Q&A session. But what I wanted to say that this has been a unique Zoom experience for us all, in that we had to start out with a substitute speaker, and then ultimately you came along and we were able to capture your presentation. I hope that we provided enough time for you to go through it. I enjoyed it particularly. And one of the things that KCOR has been looking at, and it was just last week when we had an in-person meeting, one of the presenters of what she was doing as a member of our organization was talking about the complicity of many environmental factors to cancer. And she had a book which is called Cancer, 101 Solutions to a Preventable Epidemic. And so then when I try to marry that book, which I've really just gotten into, to your presentation, where we're talking about the availability and scarcity of water, one thing that I noted was that you didn't talk about the quality of water and the contamination that we have seen in the agricultural system with water, which contains all kinds of human chemicals in terms of likelihood of causing cancer or many other different factors. So yes, the countries that are able to produce food can do it as long as they can continue to use those controlling chemicals. but then we're sending those things off to the people that are suffering most.
Yeah,
Any
no,
comment?
I think it's a good comment. I mean, for people who are drinking unsafe drinking water, just even from biological contamination, their primary concern is not going to be necessarily around some of the issues that have been raised. I'm not trivializing that they're important issues, but when the 3 billion people who are not having, not drinking water that's not even measured in any form in terms of its quality, probably when it gets to the household doesn't have any treatment on it, any treatment. That's probably their primary consideration. That's certainly the consider, in the circles that look at water, that's like sort of the number one priority. For countries such as Australia or Canada and other places which have, at least in urban areas, very very sophisticated treatment systems, and measurements have got much better over the years, we can identify a whole series of things that are in the water supply that are potentially causing a whole series of health consequences. I'm not trying to trivialize, I'm just saying it's a different order of magnitude of the problem. You've highlighted another set of issues. So there's the contamination in the water we drink, but there's contamination in the water in the rivers and streams and groundwater through the production process. It's both industrial and agricultural. So one of the highlights in that is nitrates. So we're using a lot of nitrogen fertilizer and also phosphates as well. That has implications for water quality, lakes in particular with phosphates, but nitrates in terms of drinking water. Nitrates, there are standards for that, but there's a lot of people, including, when I say a lot, I can't give you the numbers, but nitrates contamination in water supply is actually getting worse, is not getting better, at least in Western Europe, and I've got numbers for. So yeah, all of those come together. The too dirty is not just a consumption, wash, safe water and sanitation and hygiene and drinking water, is also a whole set of issues around the production side and the impacts on water quality. So there are places you can go in the world, and including in Canada, but you see the contamination directly in the water supply, and it's near Delhi in fact. So there's it's a big problem. I agree, and it no doubt is causing increased morbidities and mortalities associated with it that goes beyond the standard measures of water quality.
Okay, well, thank you. I have 3 people lined up for questions: John Legg, Art Hunter, and Peter McKinnon. So, John, would you take the floor, and Art, you'll be on deck. Where's John?
I'm here trying to. I'm trying to start the video, but without any success. We'll try one more time, and then you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. Okay. Well, anyway, I can.
So go ahead with your question.
Start my okay. My question is a rather broad one, and I started to write it when Paul Beckwith was exposing us, and I'll pick this up. There are about 3 sentences here. He exposes to the problems that the COP system carries with it. And then Dr. Grafton, Quentin, came in. So I'm not sure whether my question, I would be interested in any concerned person's comments. I'll finish the question, and you can decide whether you think it's too broad, Phil. So the question is, since we're faced with disunity within the group that wants to lower greenhouse gases, and a united, self-interested oil and gas industry, should KCOR try to focus the message we're trying to communicate? And then I make a comment about, I believe that the global practice at present is to use individual countries as the basis for global decisions. That is what the UN does now. So that being the case, and now it's a highly political question. That being the case, I see a strong argument to try to freeze Alberta out by supporting the federal government's general practice now, but with more vigor. That is, the federal should be doing more of what they're doing. And so I leave it to you. I finish by saying, what is the reaction of those on this Zoom meeting? Because we were then in between Paul Beckworth and Quentin Grafton. So I'm in your hands, Paul, Phil.
Well, I'm not going to comment. That's your prerogative. And so, Quentin?
Well, I think it's probably more for Paul. In terms of climate, he's the expert, not me. I can just give a quick response in terms of how we respond to what's going on. I mean, so the pedagogy of the oppressed by Oli Fayette's work, he talks about dialogue, but dialogue has two components to it. One is the reflection, which clearly what Club of Rome is doing. It's a reflection about what is going on, a diagnosis. An understanding of the drivers and determinants and way to move forward. And the second one, of course, is the action. We certainly aren't getting the action. And so the true dialogue brings the two together. And I don't think we've got that together. And I think there are ways to bring that together. And certainly Paul's response about COP is I absolutely agree with, but it's not just a COP issue, it's a general issue. You've this view of we filling the gaps is just an acceptance that the current state of the world is more or less okay, but we can just put some bells and whistles and tinker it a bit. It's not the case, and that's a misdiagnosis, inadequate reflection, and therefore the actions are therefore insufficient or misguided. So we step back and reflect, then the system is quite different to what people think it is, and the framing's different. It's a triage situation, in my view. Then the actions are going to be very different, and that's the space we need to be in. COP28 is in another world altogether. It's in the wrong space, the wrong headspace, and wrong. I'm sad to say. So that's my quick response. But
Paul?
I'll just add a few things. I mean, I think it's really clear to many people, this year that with this COP28, with everything going on, that the whole process is broken and needs to change. The whole idea of having these massive climate conferences, I would argue the whole IPCC process, putting out these massive documents every 7 years, is pretty useless. I mean, things are changing so quickly. By the time these reports come out, they're out of date. So I think the idea. I mean, John Kerry had high hopes for this COP. He's had lots of meetings with the Sheikh, who's the COP president. But documents have uncovered that every single bilateral meeting with countries over the last year has involved promoting ADNOC, which is the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, which is one of the fastest growing oil companies in the world. The UAE is a small country, 10 million people, only 1 million are citizens, but they produce about 7%. They're the world's seventh largest oil producer. I think they're well over 4 million barrels a day. We're burning 100 right now, over 100 in the world. Things are all moving in the wrong direction. And I think, the UN should be completely embarrassed about what's been happening with their climate conference this year, and they need to make changes. At the present growth rate of fossil fuel lobbyists at the COP, they'll be 100% of attendees will be fossil fuel lobbyists by the time we reach COP 35 or something. right? So, I mean, the absurdities just build upon each other. And, you know, I mean, you can see the oil companies are in charge. I mean, the movement to natural gas as a bridge fuel, completely driven by fossil fuel companies, right? The turn to liquefied natural gas, completely driven by them. And the new thing that they'll be driving is a hydrogen economy, right? Extracting hydrogen from the fossil fuels and then burning the hydrogen cleanly. The only problem with that is hydrogen leaks into the atmosphere, wipe out the hydroxide cleansing ability in the atmosphere. So hydroxide is it's a universal cleanser of the atmosphere. It breaks down methane, for example, and is the reason why methane lifetime in the atmosphere is like 9 or 10 years. You know, with hydrogen being released from a hydrogen economy, methane lifetimes will go way, way up. So that will, you know, exacerbate that problem. So we can't have the fossil fuel companies running governments, running our society, our human civilization societies, because it's just not working. And so we need to, you know, we're running out of time, basically. I mean, these critical feedback loops are kicking into play, and warming is greatly accelerating, and we're getting we're losing the ability to do anything to address the climate problem, because the longer we wait, the more the Earth systems respond to the warming we've already had and cause huge so-called natural emissions of the greenhouse gases, basically taking things out of our hands. You know, like the warming of the southern oceans is a huge concern. I mean, we know that we're missing a couple million square kilometers of Antarctic sea ice. You know, why is this a problem? The warming of the southern ocean, because it's one of the largest carbon sinks in the world. And that sink is greatly reduced with the warming and stratification of the ocean. So basically, yeah, we basically failed to address climate change in any way, shape, or form, and we're suffering the consequences now.
So, Quentin, do you want to reply, or shall we move on to our topic?
No, all good, all good.
Phil, can I just add 3 or 4 sentences? I appreciate very much your down-to-earth approach, Paul, and I think you're absolutely right, except for one comment of yours, that the UN should be embarrassed. The UN is nothing but a functioning group of people in a building in New York City, and without an interested, as opposed to a disinterested, and I use disinterest in the best possible way, of these people who are toiling away in that building. They don't, there's no such thing as an embarrassment of the UN, except for those people who feel a certain togetherness in that building. So I find it very, I simply want to return to keeping Canada strong and united in from a global point of view. And right now, with Alberta acting as it is not helping at all. And so that's why I suggest trying to freeze them out. And that's really what the federal government is doing. They're doing positive things, except they're not doing them fast enough and hard enough. And maybe that is the philosophy. So that's my feedback to the 2 answers, for which I thank Dr. Grafton and Paul.
By the way,
Okay.
Alberta, Danielle Smith led a contingent of 100 people from Alberta to the COP. They basically have their own pavilion or booths apart from Canada's, as does Saskatchewan. So
Exactly.
they're acting kind of independently at COP
Exactly.
of the Canadian government.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, Art, what have you got to say?
on the UN process. Look, the UN is widely criticized for failing to do a whole bunch of different things, but when it comes to climate change and climate change negotiations, it has to be at a UN basis. We can't. There's no other way. I mean, that's the way the world operates, you know, at a country level in that sense. So we have to live with it. I would argue, and I think this is what Paul was saying, maybe in a difference connected to this is, and I've argued previously that you know, to take the climate change negotiations out of the Conference of the Parties, take it to the to the UN General Assembly in New York City. At special sessions. So the General Assembly room is not very large. You won't be able to get a bunch of oil sheiks hanging around and all the lobbyists, etc. So you get the diplomats, the government representatives, and then you start to get people who make those decisions, starting to make those decisions, and I think in a better framing. That would be my brief take on it. Whatever that helps, I don't.
Yeah, when I said that, I mean the UN has lost control of the conference, I guess.
Yes.
When I say they should be embarrassed, you know, the UN's under criticism from lots of people. I think the UN as a global governing body and what they do, they need to have more power and more money and more influence. Some people have argued that. I mean. I'll bring in another thing, and you might take it controversially, but Israel has almost declared war on the UN. Look at the number of UN observers and UN people that have been killed in the bombings. They've lost all kinds of people on the ground, record numbers of people, far more than in any other conflict that's ever happened, the UN. And, you know, there's UN people high up that are not getting visas to go back and continue their work. So I just want to point that out. The UN, I don't know how the International Criminal Court is set up, but they also seem to have no power. I mean, they're supposed to uphold and tell countries when war crimes are occurring. And, you know, bombing children and babies day in, day out, you know, and trying to justify that, that's like, you know, we're in a very strange place right now in the world, you know, and it's all connected together.
Yep.
So if I may, if I could sort of allow Art to have his say, and then we'll move on to Peter after that.
All right. I'd like to, of course, in the same theme, I have given up on COP, you know, several COPs back, and the world of mitigation and adaptation is not going to function at the UN level, no matter how many meetings are held. And it really comes down to, at least in my perception, to municipalities, to communities, and ultimately individuals. And the world really should be looking at some plan to survive, and maybe that could be at the municipality, community, and individual level. I know that within KCOR we have addressed that and really have come down and saying it's up to the individual, because you can't count on your government. Now, to get back to water, I think everything that you said, Quentin, is thrown out as soon as the sea level rises, because then all of a sudden the contamination and sewage backups and the water processing systems and everything in every major city, which happens to be on the seacoast, or most of them are, and so we have some major concerns. You talked about the nexus of food, water, and energy, and I quite agree with that. In the world of energy, there's been some some discussion that says, hey, the best place for small modular reactors is to be on a barge like the Russians have done and up in the Arctic and such that they can take energy generation to wherever the requirement is that's been flooded out or whatever has happened. And you can extend that into all the small islands in the Pacific and in fact into Vancouver and Halifax. When I take a look at water and put it in the same context, perhaps it's time that people start talking about water desalination and purification plants on barges that can be shipped around to those places of need. And because there's going to be an enormous stress as we talk about, sanitation and the contamination, disease spread, etc., that's going to happen. I just want to add another little comment that I'm familiar with the area down around Corpus Christi, Texas, and that the land rises very slowly and it's very flat. So if we get a couple of meters rise in the sea level, I mean, that's knocking out almost half of Texas, and you'll see just major cities constantly underwater, and that just means people are migrating and considerable chaos, and so it is not the confusion that's going to happen as the sea level rises really is going to impact all food, water, and energy considerations. Anyway, has anyone ever mentioned to you or suggested to you, Quentin, the concept of using barges for desalination of water and purification?
No, I mean, you can certainly put desal plants on barges. They're large, but it certainly can be done. The issue around desal is that the energy requirements, it depends what energy source you're using. It's a reverse osmosis process. It requires a substantial amount of energy. So those barges themselves would need to have energy sources. They wouldn't be able to use renewables based on the barge themselves. They'd have to have external sources to be able to because the panels wouldn't be sufficient. So what energy sources they'd use, you'd have to think about that. But when it comes to the water challenge, in the context of extractions or withdrawals, it's really an agricultural story. And so desal doesn't work for agriculture because if you, first of all, although there's a lot of agriculture that takes place, in coastal areas, there's a lot of agriculture that takes place away from coastal areas as well. And so moving water around is expensive in terms of energy. And that has implications for the ability to produce crops and all the other stuff that goes along with that. So it's a story that works for persons primarily, for high value uses, drinking water, for example, in coastal locations, if there's energy sources available. And then it, I mean, in the UAE right now, I mean, pretty much all the water they're using is desal. They've got the energy to do that, and it's to a high value use, drinking water for swimming pools, etc. So that's all doable, and we know how to do it, and there's multiple ways of doing it. You don't have to have oil and gas to do that, but to resolve the water crisis, that won't resolve the water crisis. It's not going to deal with it. It is there are technologies in addition to what you just highlighted that can work well in emergency situations, but they're not a solution. So, for example, they call them air to water technologies. I've seen them operating. They're very low scale. So you've got a few solar panels. They suck up the the water out of the atmosphere, and they can produce, a liter of water, depending on the size of the unit. Now, that's not a solution to the water crisis in any sense. People claim that it is, but it's a technological solution that works well, let's say, in a cyclone hurricane event in the Pacific Islands. You can't bring in RO units so quickly. You can't even bring in purified water in a very limited way. So having those units in stored facilities, and if when a cyclone happens, you can bring them out, and they can provide drinking water easily and it's a decentralized approach to that problem. So I think there are a number of technological things that can be done to respond to those sorts of extremes, desal, as you were saying, but I don't think they will deal with the fundamental issues of the world water crisis. I think they have to be dealt with another, with another framing, I would think.
All right, it seems to me that there's no way that we can proceed without a major population correction taking place, because none of this is happening.
Yep. I mean, I wasn't so so forthright, but you can see the implications from my presentation that's coming. And that's on the food. That's just the food dimension. Okay, by 2050. So yeah, you can't put 50% of the population of a country into food insecurity, as in they don't have enough calories, without a massive implication of what that means. They either move or they don't continue to live. They're only really. There's really no other choices at that point. That's why we have to plan and adapt and do a number of different things now. Otherwise, that's the world that's coming. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So your question, Peter, and then Samrat, you're up next.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Quentin, for your presentation, and also to Paul for an extra treat that he added at the beginning. That was very nice of you, Paul, to do that. I posed a question in the chat to Quentin, and he's already answered it. So the question I posed was, and then I'll elaborate. Have you ever come across the concept of planetary boundaries, and have you integrated your thoughts? Have you thought about integrating your work into this concept? And this is something that he's answered to me, and he is aware. And of course, he mentioned about green water and blue water, and that's one of the boundaries is a green water one was recently introduced. So I'd just like to add to my question then, Quentin. What is it that you object to in terms of the data? As you know, the planetary boundaries has made a point that they don't know where the boundary is in many cases, and therefore, what are the data that are going to set the boundary? And of course, it's just like the extinction rate. With the life forms on the planet, we know that there's extinction, but we don't know what the normal rate is. So are we seeing something higher than usual or lower than usual on average, et cetera, et cetera? So all these have those flexibilities or unknowns. So I'm just wondering what your issue is about like water, because that's a very good point you raised. Thank you.
Okay, so green water is actually defined by the soil moisture. Okay, so the way they do it, they took green water as the water in the atmosphere. It's not actually correct, so we can quibble on that.
Well, don't they use the 2 meter? The 2 meter depth?
Yeah, but if you talk about, I mean, they talk about the water cycle has changed, and I'm sure they're right on that. So it's beyond my expertise, So the water cycle has changed in the Anthropocene vis-a-vis the Holocene. So that change themselves says we're bringing ourselves to this green water boundary. Now, the physics that I do know that we are actually going to have the hydrological cycle operating at a faster rate. So we're getting more water in that sense, and certainly as ice melts we get more water, so it's just going to be in the wrong places, and it's going to come in times and frequencies, etc., that will be problematic for us, particularly for agriculture. So that's a problem, but I don't think we can conceive of it as a green water boundary. Okay, I think that's a misrepresentation of the challenge, because it misdiagnoses, and then it says, oh, well, what do we do? Well, then we're going to have, these atmospheric watersheds that we're going to sort of manage in some sort of UN focus. It misdirects us from the fundamental issues of over extraction. So when I calculate a planetary boundary or blue water limit, and others have done, I mean, this has been done by, I don't know, 15 to 20 researchers around the world at different times. I mean, it's about that number. It's more than a dozen. Okay, and I'm one of them. Then we calculate in a very different way to the way Rockstrom et al. Calculated, and I think a bottom-up calculation is the way to do it. So you calculate it from over extraction from groundwater, which is the blue water, and then you've got the other. So I think that's the way to do it. So I think there's a blue water limit or boundary. I have no problem with that. But to point out that when the first boundary came out, I wrote to them about the fact that water was not included. And a lot of people in the water world said that doesn't make sense. There's a blue water limit. We've already passed it, etc., and got no response. Okay. Now they finally discovered that there's a water boundary, which we've been saying for a long time, but then they've added another dimension, green, and I think they've got it wrong. It's about academics, I suppose, researchers disputing numbers, but they do matter. Just to re-emphasize, by focusing on the green water and the perturbation of the hydrological cycle, you're misdiagnosing the problem. It becomes a climate change problem or whatever. It's not that. Water crisis existed and will exist even if we solve the mitigation issue with climate change. It's a problem, and it exists. It magnifies, but it's a problem, and that's where I think they're wrong. And I think we have to think about stepping back and doing the right diagnosis. So that's why I think it's a good pedagogical tool, but I think for taking us into solutions, I think planetary boundaries have some real challenges. But anyway, that's a personal perspective.
Certainly, and I totally agree. I mean, there's a lot of data yet to be qualified to even define these boundaries on any of the boundaries. Really, I suppose climate change is the most visible one. The second, probably most visible one is biodiversity collapse.
Yes.
But these are numbers yet to be determined, and I totally agree what you said. But as a concept, I might add that since I gave a talk on this topic to KCOR, several members of KCOR and myself and others have now joined together, and we're looking at using this planetary boundary concept as a whole of government approach to addressing critical infrastructure as we deal with the changing environment. And this is one of the concepts that I think has been an interesting trigger from a talk that we, did just like you've done today. And it's quite active. I'm dealing with some of the senior people in the Canadian government on this, or former Canadian senior people in Canadian government. A number of the people here will know Robert Walker, who's formerly the head of Canadian Nuclear Labs. He's very involved with me on this.
Yeah, so I mean, just two quick responses. So I mean, so the notion of the donut, of course, you've got the social, economic, and the planetary bringing together. I think is a very good pedagogical tool. But I mean, I tend to look at the limits and tipping points, and I don't think the planetary boundaries is useful as that, but I think it's the tipping points. This is is a better framing from my perspective. I'm not saying, I'm just, so I think the tipping points are critically important. It's about the cascading of systemic risks. And if you do tipping points and that sort of framing, I think you're much better off than planetary boundary, which tends to put things into different little silos, and say, well, here it is, here we're at, and we a bit of this and a bit of that. No, we're all connected in this. Let's nexus thinking, systems thinking. I think it allows us to get beyond that. And certainly the tipping points. I mean, Paul's highlighted, you're all aware of those tipping points. We've probably crossed them, or some of them. Hopefully not, but probably have. That's the sort of thinking I would think we need to be focusing, which is a risk framing, which is really quite different, I think, to a planetary boundary framing. So sorry to, so yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
So that's maybe my concluding mark here. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So out of curiosity, Paul, do you have any comments that you would like to make?
Yeah, the host has stopped my video, so I can't start my video, first of all.
Well, carry on talking.
Whoever blocked it, I don't know. But anyway, yeah, on tipping points, a big report was just released at COP just today on tipping points. Okay, Stefan Ramsdorf is involved. Like it's a big major scientific report on tipping points that's just being released at COP. And it talks about 5 of the main ones, I think. I haven't read it yet. It just came out this morning. I was talking about the methane rise. I've just been glancing at today's Economist. December 2nd is the date, and it's got an entire section on methane and climate change. And there's a whole article titled "Termination Shock. Rising methane levels look ominously like those at the end of the last ice ages." And it goes on, it goes into good detail. It talks about, you know, most of the methane coming up is carbon 12 as opposed to carbon 13, right? The isotopic ratio is lower. Bacteria, which break down organic matter in wetlands, they much prefer the lighter carbon. So Nesbitt is mentioned in this article. He estimates that post 2006, the increase 35, as much as 45% of the methane increase since 2006 has come from wetlands, he believes, from the isotopic data. Of course, this has to be confirmed by other scientists. So this is an example of a strong, very, very strong feedback or tipping point. I mean, at the end of previous ice ages, methane rose about 300 parts per billion, from about 400 to 700 or so. You know, humans have turned methane from about that 700 to about 2100 or so, 1900 parts per billion, right? That's what we've done already. So it shouldn't be a big surprise, you know, if we gain several hundred parts per billion over the next few decades, right? I mean, the rates are heading up that way, and this will basically take a lot of climate change out of our hands to do anything at all, unless we deploy, unless we manage to scale up and deploy things like carbon capture. But more importantly, that we buy ourselves time to do this and to reach, you know, and to greatly accelerate renewables by using something called solar radiation management, which is extremely controversial, and it's got very, very little funding or money because people just say it's horrible. You know, it's going to destroy the planet. Well, I mean, you have to look at the risks of doing it versus not doing it. And not doing it, you know, our planet is spiraling out of control to much higher temperatures. But we don't have the luxury of having these COPs and discussing this stuff because the Earth itself, we poked it with a stick and it's very angry at us. And the climate is responding. And, you know, we think we're in control, but we're not. I mean, the Earth is. Right? And if it's going to start spewing out greenhouse gases that dwarf all human cumulative emissions up to now, then there's not a heck of a lot we can do about it. But we can try to do some things. And the only things we can do are the carbon capture and solar radiation management. Right? That's about it. That's all we have left. And yet, you know, until now, this stuff is never, it's always downplayed. Oh, we can't do that. You know, it'll make the fossil fuel companies think they can have more and more emissions. Well, by my way of thinking, if we come up with technologies to capture way more carbon than we emit, then I don't care if fossil fuel companies keep emitting something. You know, if we can capture double of what they emit, for example, right? So we need vast amounts of money redirected from the military to climate stuff, to capture and to renewables and stuff. I mean, we're the enemy. We don't recognize the enemy. The enemy is another nation. The enemy is a massive change in our planetary life support systems, which are being degraded.
Paul, can we allow Quentin to respond, and then we'll go to Samrat?
Yeah.
Oh, look,
So
anyway,
the stuff's becoming mainstream. When it appears in The Economist in my books.
Yeah. So I those sort of technologies are what they do, and at least in the stratosphere are worrying, and they are risky. But I get your point, Paul. I mean, the issue that I think is worth highlighting here, there is a downside to this, and I see it all around me, and you certainly see it at COP, is the net zero by 2050, which is a complete bullshit story, of course. But because the claim is we'll have these negative emissions, then it allows the fossil fuel companies and governments, they're complicit, to carry on more or less business as usual with some tweaks, 1% increase in emissions, of course, in 2023. So that's the downside to it. And so I do think it has actually allowed that narrative to say, well, let's keep on doing emissions because we're going to be able to suck that sucker out of the air. And of course, when you look at the numbers, 37 gigatons or whatever it is, the scale of it is enormous. So let's say it's even at 10 gigatons, less than a third of what we're currently doing. I mean, that the scale is enormous. So that's not going to happen. I mean, I used to work in the in the government and a mining context with the scales. That's not going to happen in the next 2 decades. Yeah. So it's not that you were saying that, but it ain't going to happen. There's no way we can get that scale going.
Quentin,
We won't be able to take the carbon out of the atmosphere by 2050 in any meaningful way.
Sorry about the phone ring. I can't answer that and do this as well. But anyway, Quentin, the next question is coming from Samrat, who is speaking from Spain, where he lives.
Yeah. Hi, Quentin, and thanks so much for the presentation. Hi, Paul. Thanks for the presentation as well.
Yeah.
I have a question, which if you can just answer in a short way, because we're short of time. I've heard the both of you very closely right now, and amazing things have been said. So my question is that without technology, we don't have a way out. And we very well know that earlier technologies have brought us to this problem. So do you think there is any other way in a yes or no context?
Well, if you want a yes or no, I mean, technology is going to be helpful to us, no question about it. But technology itself is not going to resolve this, because the problem lies in the system that we live in, the economic system we live in. So unless we respond to how that's set up and how it's governed, technology is not going to solve that. That's my quick answer.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for saying it so so clearly. Yeah. Paul, would you like to say anything to that? Because my question earlier was to you originally.
Yeah, it's I mean, we've set in motion, by our cumulative burning of fossil fuels, we've changed the chemistry of our atmosphere and oceans, and we're seeing the consequences of these changes, and these changes are still accelerating, and we're still subsidizing fossil fuels to the tune of about $7 trillion a year. That includes indirect subsidies as well as direct subsidies. So we're making the problem, we're accelerating off the cliff. All these COPs, etc., have done absolutely nothing. We're accelerating off the cliff faster and faster. So, you can worry about it and try to make a difference, but I think people at this stage need to accept that there's very little an individual can do. The planet is massively changing, and where's it going to end up? How is it going to change? And how many people are going to come out of the end of it? And many people have argued maybe half a billion people will come out of the end of it. So that's a large, are we peaking at 9 billion, 10 billion people on the planet? I mean, are we going to get there? It depends on whether climate change is kind enough to let human population get there, or whether, you know, it creates global food shortages, which greatly curtail population. You know, in the next 10, it's all coming to a head. We don't have to wait that long. We live in a unique time in human history. 108 billion people have lived on this planet before us. You know, we're 8 billion. We're still a very young species, you know, if you put us in the context of other species of mammals. You know, there should literally be thousands of generations following us, but that's not going to happen the way we're going.
Okay, well,
so that's just the reality of it. So, I mean, you know, we can talk about it all we want, but this is what the best science is showing. You head somewhere, you eventually reach that place unless you do something to stop that, and we haven't.
So thank you, Paul.
Thanks. Thanks both of you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. We've got about another 5 minutes before our usual time is up, and Claude Butner hasn't had a chance to present his questions. Quentin, Paul is from the United States, from the south side of the Great Lakes.
Actually, I don't have a question, but since you have set me up for one, I will point out that I put a link to the Arctic News blogspot, and there's many contributors to that space, including Guy McPherson and Hansen himself, and Malcolm Light, who has written a lot in the, say, the 2000s in that decade about methane. So I think that I'd like to go back and revisit that. And what Paul was mentioning about the release, you know, it takes it out of our control. And, you know, the use of the term methane bomb was sort of squelched, and then they went to methane burp. But I think that the principle is still there. At some point in the warming of the Arctic Sea, which is very shallow on the Russian side, and all of this information is in there. So I'm going to encourage people, if you don't save the chat, at least to poke the button and peruse those articles. So I will ask Quentin, it seems to me that food eventually will bring us down. This is not, you know, I'm not an ecologist, but the center of mass of what I read and hear, including what's presented on KCOR, and that people will suffer with bad water. So the water quality question is for surviving people, you know, without facing mass starvation. When you face mass starvation, the quality of water becomes a very insignificant question compared with the other things that are going to bring you down. So do you see any evidence of federal governments, at least in Australia, for example, and in the United States here, it seems like we're just walking right into, there's not enough water. We're going to have to set in bottled water on truck convoys on a massive scale very soon. And it's like there's no impetus to address the problem in a very real sense. It's like cross your fingers, maybe it's going to rain more.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the drinking water, safe drinking water can be delivered in any rich, high-income country. Everybody should have it. In Australia, we have remote, typically Indigenous Australians suffering from drinking water quality that's unacceptable in any sense. But that doesn't need to happen. It doesn't need to happen in the United States, doesn't need to happen in Canada. It happens in Canada, it happens in Australia. So I think all of that's easily fixed. Okay, it's not a big deal. It will take some years to fix it, but it's fixable. US is spending a lot of money on improving water quality in a number of places, although it's missing a few important ones. But so I think that's all doable. The drinking water side, but the as you highlighted, Paul, Claude, the issue is around the agriculture. So we are continuing to get yield increases per hectare, but they are declining. So it's increasing at a declining rate, and in some cases, it's actually leveled out. Now, the promise is this CRISPR technology, we'll be able to, jumpstart and do various things. I'm not a plant, biologist to be able to, or geneticist to work that out, whether how successful that will be. But I do know scale and the lag times. And, it's typically of the order of, 10 to 20 years to bring those sorts of, miracle crops, if you want to call them, out into for general use by farmers. There may be faster times in, let's say, United States, Canada. But so we do have a problem. It's a big problem, and I according to our modeling, and I hope we're wrong. I'm not saying we could be wrong. It indicates that that we won't be able to feed the world population by 2050. That's what we're finding. I mean, that's it. I sugar-coated it in the presentation and stuff, but it depends on the scenarios and it's all of that sort of stuff. But it looks like we won't be able to feed the world population by 2050. Now, does it happen before 2050, or I don't know, but we can see this happening already. So places that are importing lots of food that are low income, and most of those countries are in Africa, but not exclusively so, they're going to suffer massive problems unless they actually increase their own food production, primarily through rain-fed agriculture. That potential does exist in some cases in Africa. And then we also need to deal with the over-withdrawals and use different ways of thinking about how we can generate that agricultural supply. Because we're basically drawing down groundwater in places like India, for example, in a way that we can't maintain those yields. Those yields in India won't be able to be maintained. So yeah, it's to me, I call it the triage. It really is that. We've got emergencies everywhere. Where's the biggest emergency that we could do something about in a fairly good way. That's how I sort of see us operating. And that's the world that Paul's talking about. That's the world I think we're in and coming in food in that space. And it's a very different world to COP28 and what the World Bank and others see. They see the world as more or less continuing as is, with a little bit of extra stuff and more finance here and more. That's a misdiagnosis, and the approaches are wrong. But certainly drinking water, we can deliver that in every rich country and can do so in the next few years. And we could deliver it much, much better elsewhere. But yes, the food story is a much, much more challenging problem. It's a big, massive problem. And most people don't see it coming. What can governments do? They can certainly invest in the R&D. That will certainly help. But there's a whole series of things that need to happen in climate adaptation and the water world as well. And they're difficult, and that requires reallocation of water. And that's a massive problem because the people who have the water do not want that to be reallocated away from them. That requires collective action.
With this very negative point of our presentation and our time running out, I would like to have Art sort of say thank you on our behalf. I found it very interesting, and hopefully we'll be able to rejoin you with more of your thoughts at a later date.
Thank you.
Okay. We've had clearly a makeshift and try and get everything working together here, and I think we've done fairly well. Both Quentin and Paul have really put together a far better view of both the COP and the challenges ahead of us. And I thank you both for putting forward your expertise and sharing it with us. I also would like to remind all those who are watching us on YouTube that we are the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, and you can see our website URL on this closing slide. And we do encourage you to come and take a look around our website. It is updated every week, and with new materials. And if you sign up to our Stay Informed, you will get one email a week from us saying all those things which we have participated in the past week. And for any Canadians considering joining us, we are a Canadian charity, and you will get a tax receipt from your membership fee. And hence, in closing, I would like to make one final statement that says I congratulate both Quentin and Paul for jumping in here and turning it into a very interesting afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Very much appreciate it.